Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Today's webinar is being presented by the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as STAP. STAP is a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Clean Energy States Alliance. And our topic for today's webinar is the State of the U.S. Energy Storage Industry 2023 Year in Review. This is an annual webinar that we've been doing for quite a while now, and it's one of my personal favorites. So I'm excited to be here, excited to have a really great panel of speakers lined up. And we'll pass it over to them shortly. For now, I'll go over a few very quick webinar logistics. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also click on that orange arrow to expand your webinar console. And one thing you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments to our esteemed panel. We will have a Q&A at the end of our webinar. And this is an hour-and-a-half long webinar in order to accommodate the huge amount of exciting content that we have. So we'll have at least 15 minutes, probably more, for a Q&A at the end. Type your questions in. We'll get to as many as we can. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will be posting those materials on our website, seisa.org/webinars, today or tomorrow. So with that, I'm pleased to pass it over to my colleague, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a Senior Project Director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he is moderating our webinar today.
Great. Thanks very much, Samantha, and welcome everybody to the webinar. This is, I don't know how many of these we've done, but every year at the beginning of the year, we do this annual webinar, kind of looking back at the year in energy storage, looking at the industry trends, what's happened, and what we think is going to be happening in the future. And always in the past, we've had one speaker that does this presentation, but you know, the good news is that the energy storage industry has been growing and expanding so quickly, and there are so many states developing policy and programs, and so many interesting new things happening with you know, batteries and other types of storage and supply chains and so forth, that we felt that we really needed more than one person to cover all the material. So we have some fantastic speakers, actually 3 main speakers, and then a couple of additional speakers who are doing little introductory remarks and queuing up the conversation. And we will, as always, try to cover as many of your questions as we can at the end. So type the questions in as they occur to you. During the presentations, I'll be going through the questions, and we will, again, address as many of them as we can get to. Let me do a little brief introduction of SEIA. Clean Energy States Alliance. We are celebrating 20 years working with state energy agencies across the country, helping them to develop and run their programs and policy in all sorts of clean energy areas of interest. And it's basically whatever they need help with is what we try to do. I am showing here the logos of our membership. These are state energy agencies that we work with very closely. There we go. And I think I skipped a slide. There we go. Yes, we have, in addition to our general work with states, engaged in a number of specific projects. This one in particular, STAP, the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, is the project that this webinar falls into, and many webinars that we've done over the years. We conduct this under contract with Sandia National Laboratories, and it's funded by US DOE Office of Electricity. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Imre Gyuk with us today from DOE Office of Electricity, and Waylon Clark from the Sandia National Laboratories. So you'll be meeting them both as well. We do lots of things under STAP besides webinars, and chiefly we try to get states to the table to partner with Sandia and DOE on energy storage project development. Before I go on, I do want to thank Dr. Gyuk and Waylon Clark for making all of this possible. I'm going to introduce our webinar speakers very briefly. We did put their bios in the handout section. If you look at the webinar console, there's a little expandable section called handouts. If you want more information, you can get it there. For now, I will just make a very brief introduction. So we will be hearing first from Dr. Gyuk from DOE Office of Electricity. He's the Director of Energy Storage Research. We'll then hear from Ted Coe, Executive Director of the Energy Policy Design Institute, who is going to speak on state-level energy storage policy and market development. We'll hear from Julian Boggs, Director of State Policy for Key Capture Energy on the economics of battery storage and wholesale markets. And then we will hear from Joan White, Director of Storage and Interconnection for the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA, on the global supply chain, battery chemistries, and safety. And before we do all this, I'm going to do a little table setting and try to put a little context around this series of presentations. And I'll try to keep this very brief. So this, most of this information is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, by the way, and it's early release for their upcoming annual report. So these are the most recent. This is the most recent information that we have. And if you look at this, there's a couple things I want to point out. This shows you the operating capacity and annual capacity additions for large-scale battery storage in the U.S. This is not considering anything below a megawatt in capacity. This is what they consider large or utility scale. And one thing I want to point out is that starting around 2020, curve seems to change from something that looked sort of linear to something that's starting to look closer to an exponential curve. And that's pretty exciting. And yes, some of this is history and some of it is planned, but if you look at just from 2020 to 2021 and then 2022, you see that things are taking off. The other thing I want to point out here is that although that's true, there seems to be a lot of unrealized potential in much of the country. This growth is dominated by California and Texas. You can see that on the multicolored bar on the right there. ERCOT is Texas, CAISO is California, and then you have sort of everyone else coming after that. And here's a little bit easier way to look at it. So in terms of, again, the installed capacity, California way out ahead, then Texas, and then sort of everybody else. Now, if you're wondering what is being done with all these batteries, here is the reported applications. And this is, again, utility scale battery. This is not the kind of thing that you have in your garage at home or that the local commercial or industrial facility might have. This is large utility scale batteries. And if you look at this, really frequency regulation and arbitrage are the top sort of applications, but there are many applications. And things that are further down on the list now may rise up the list in the future. So what's interesting to me about this is that there are just so many different things that people are using, that utilities are using, and large scale merchant storage owners are using batteries to do. If you're wondering about the smaller scale systems under a megawatt, this gives you a sense of what's going on there. Really, residential batteries are leading in the small scale applications. And this includes, even if you combine commercial and industrial, still it's not even half of the total capacity of installed residential battery systems. And you really see that when you look at all the solar installers that are now partnered with battery companies, and they are out there installing solar and storage systems and offering those to residential customers with financing, with leasing options, all sorts of things. It really is remarkable how popular this is, but it's still quite small compared to large scale capacity. So on the left here, you can see the comparison there. Small scale storage has a lot of growth opportunity here. And And interestingly, again, it's mostly in California. So about 75% of the small scale storage capacity is in California. Globally, it's a good reminder that the vast majority of storage is still pumped hydro. And of what remains, if you take out the pumped hydro, the vast majority is lithium-ion batteries. And one thing more, I just want to leave you with this thought. Demand from EVs will account for 89% of the global lithium-ion battery demand by 2040. If you look at the the situation even 2020, 2021, it's clear that the energy storage systems, which is the stationary systems, which is that gray color, is almost you can't even see it against all the EV batteries and portable electronics. And the EV demand is slated to grow quite quickly. So that has some implications for the lithium market, and we'll probably hear more about that, I'm guessing, as we go along. So with that, I will pass the baton to Dr. Imre Gyuk from US DOE Office of Electricity for his remarks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Imre Gyuk, Chief Scientist for Energy Storage in the Office of Electricity. If we look at what's happening, we are, if you wish, blinded by huge establishments. These are the ones that are most obvious. Kern County, California, 825 megawatt in solar, coupled with 3,320 megawatt hours in energy storage. This is coming online. South Africa, 540 megawatt of solar and 1,140 megawatt hours of energy storage. A little bit further off, Victoria, Australia, building more storage, expecting to have a plant of 300 megawatt, 650 megawatt hours in Victoria. So these are really big grid level energy storage devices. Well, what's happening with beyond lithium? Because these are all lithium. Well, some of those are being built also. California Energy Commission is doing 30 megawatt hours of zinc bromine and 10 megawatt hours of vanadium redox batteries. It's an order of magnitude smaller than the lithium establishment, but it's nonetheless significant because these things are now coming to be on the grid in a respectable long duration mode. But what if we look at China? China built a 100 kilowatt hour sodium ion battery, grid tied. And they liked it so much that they are now planning to do a factory, a gigafactory for 30 gigawatt hours of sodium ion production. That is very remarkable, and it's the beginning of the transition from lithium to other materials. Also remarkable is an agreement which was recently reached. The Clean Energy Ministerial launched an initiative to supercharge battery storage deployment globally. And in this initiative, we find the US, Canada, Australia, and the EU. These are the biggest powers other than China in energy storage. And they have reached an agreement to boost stationary battery storage development and deployment and reduce technology cost through international cooperation and collaboration. And appropriate alignment to build a diversified, sustainable, reasonable, secure, and transparent supply chain to promote grid stability and reliability. This is remarkable because it's the first time we find an international statement of support for energy storage in a platform like the Ministerial Commission. And with that, I will leave you for the next talk.
Thank you, Dr. Gyuk. For those of you who were wondering, and we got a few questions, no, Dr. Gyuk was not using slides today. It wasn't an error. Other speakers will be using slides. So if you're looking for a visual, you will get it very shortly. We're going to turn now to Ted Coe for his presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Todd, and hello, everybody. And my name is Ted Coe. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Policy Design Institute. We can talk a little bit about that on the next slide. And I'll be talking about the progress in state-level policy for energy storage across the US. Let's go to the next slide. As an introduction, the Energy Policy Design Institute is a relatively new nonprofit organization that is dedicated to better, faster development of regulations and programs for the clean energy transition. We're using a different approach to policy development that's more of a neutral systems design approach, informed by our deep experience in a particular topic area. So in this case, energy storage is one that I've had quite a bit of experience in working in my previous jobs, most notably with STEM, an early pioneer in energy storage deployment. And so we're currently working with the Maryland Energy Storage Program Work Group and designing their statewide program for achieving their 3 gigawatt energy storage target. So that's a little bit of our background on where I'm coming from and our organization is coming from. And how we're going to talk about this in the year in review of state level policy is not going to be just a kind of a list of all the different things that have happened, which there was a lot, but more putting it into the framework of how people can look at the progress that the states are making in terms of energy storage policy, in kind of an overall framework of where we're trying to get to, in terms of the energy storage markets in each state. So the question that we want to answer, or we want to give some information towards in this webinar is how are states' laws, regulations, and proceedings of the last year and going forward doing in establishing a long-term sustainable energy storage market in each state on a state-by-state basis. And so that's what the context of which I'm gonna talk about the different policies. I'm not going to be able to list everything that has happened in every state in the last year, but I will provide a framework of which we can talk about how to put each events and policy progress in context of our eventual goals. So let's go to the next slide. So what does success look like in an actual energy storage policy from different perspectives? And so what's the state's ultimate goal for energy storage policy? And so from the ratepayer and kind of the state government's point of view and the kind of government policies point of view, I put out there that the eventual goal for the energy storage as a technology and its role on the system is that you're enabling the monetization of all the services that storage can provide and reducing the costs that states can affect. So the basic idea is, like, because storage can do so many different things and it's so versatile, the job of the policymakers and the regulators in the state is to make sure that storage can provide all the services that it's capable of providing and value and to the grid and to the ratepayers, and being compensated for it at the essentially the fair market value of what those services provide. And so that's kind of like the market creation goal of the entire policy framework. And then from the industry point of view, from the the companies that are deploying the energy storage, it's the basic equation of do projects pencil? Does the revenues, have the policies and market been set up so that the revenues exceed costs, and eventually without any incentives or subsidies? So can we get to the point where we have a sustainable market where we can deploy this technology in all the different market segments, front of the meter, behind the meter, transmission level, distribution level, without special incentives or subsidies from the government to do that? And so if you think about it in those contexts, you can think about it as the kinds of different types of policies and the areas that they affect for the energy storage market. And the 4 rows I have down there on this table are targets, like energy storage targets, and then there's revenue affecting policies, there's cost affecting policies, and then there's incentives, which are separate, which I define separately from revenues and costs. And you can put different states on this kind of spectrum of how far how mature they are in developing the policies for these different types of policies for the energy storage market. I won't go through all of them specifically here, but it's a good example to show that there are some states that are have just passed energy storage targets but they haven't actually started implementing anything yet. Or there are some states that are much farther along in terms of their revenue type policies, like grid services programs, or early in that. And then some of them have been doing incentives for a while, like direct rebates and subsidies for a while, but some of them are just trying them out. So it's a good way of thinking about it in context of when you look back in the last year in what's happened in the policy realm, is where does it put that state on this kind of spectrum of how mature that market is getting in terms of the ultimate sustainable market that we're all trying to get to. So and I'm talking really fast, and there may be a lot of questions, and we're going to save the questions for the end after all the speakers have gone. But I'm trying to go through this relatively quickly so that we have a lot of time for questions. Let's go to the next slide. So if you look at those different types of policies, one of the things is to look at energy storage targets, usually mandated by the legislature, and they're useful to move the agencies and all the stakeholders in the state into action on energy storage. But they don't, in and of themselves, they don't actually advance the market until you actually start putting in some of these mechanisms, some of these programs, and some of these subsidies and stuff in place before the actual market actually starts going. So some of the sample of energy storage targets activity that's happened in the last year is that both Maryland and Michigan passed energy storage targets, fairly aggressive ones. But then a few other states introduced legislation that didn't actually make it through this past session. Like Illinois introduced a pretty aggressive one, as well as Maine introduced legislation to increase their existing target. And then one of the other things that's not directly legislation related, but is a sign of kind of a more mature market in terms of an energy storage target, is New York, which has had a 3 gigawatt target for a while, 3 gigawatt by 2030 target for a few years now. But then they recognize that they want to hit their climate change goals, that they would need a more aggressive target for energy storage to balance out all the renewables that they want to bring onto the system. And so they proposed in the last year to increase that target to 6 gigawatts, and then also proposed a roadmap, a policy roadmap to go with it, to help achieve that 6 gigawatt target. So this is a good example of, they're a good example of what we're saying in terms of, like, there are mandated targets that are useful, again, that are to give everybody something to shoot for, but it doesn't actually, make a difference in the marketplace for developers or for ratepayers until we start actually implementing some programs and policies. And I think another kind of a counterexample of that are states like New Jersey, which has had a target for at least 4 years, and is still working through how to actually achieve that target with policy mechanisms and programs at the ground level. Going into the next slide. So talking about revenue policies. So the major types of revenue policies that we talk about in energy storage are typically either grid services, where we think of, like, for a lot of people think of like demand response type programs. Pay for performance is also called, where you're getting compensated for operating the battery in a way that helps the grid. There's utility procurement mechanisms, RFPs, these kinds of procurement things for utilities to procure energy storage for the grid. And then there's wholesale market revenues for the markets that have access to wholesale markets. And so some of the sample of grid services programs activities that you have are some of the one of the programs that's been around for a while, Connected Solutions in Massachusetts, was one that was designed for storage. They've had they're going kind of in their next phase of that program because they've learned a few lessons in the last couple of years, and so the last year they made several important rule changes around that program. Some of the other programs that have existed for a little while are relatively new in California. California has probably the most history in providing like grid services programs that benefit that energy storage can participate in. Includes what's called the ELRP program, which has had a few years to try out, and then the new DSGS program. So ELRP, again, Emergency Load Response Program. DSGS was Distributed Systems, can't remember exactly, Demand Services Program. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but that's a new program that launched, that was first launched in 22. And they're looking at improving the rules, and they updated some of the rules in 23. And then the Connecticut Energy Storage Program, which also launched in 22. And they also learned a bunch of lessons around like which different market segments were able to participate and had uptake versus where this, like the C&I segment had an uptake versus the residential segment not so much. So they did several rule changes in the last year also or actually just recently announced the rule changes to that program. To improve the uptake of that program. So those are some examples of the kinds of states that have tried out or trying out some new grid services programs and actually adjusting them as they learn from the success or uptake or not failure to uptake in their programs. On the utility procurement side, I haven't seen a whole lot of activity or new activity on the utility procurement side. Typically, a lot of those topic area is talking about the non-wire solutions topic area, which we've seen a few things pop up. I think there was the program in Texas popped up last year, but I haven't seen a whole lot of like major new progress in that realm in the last year or so. But again, hoping that like looking forward, that more states will recognize that they want to look at this and look at how they set up their distribution planning processes and their programs to enable storage to provide a non-wire solution for a lot of their distribution system upgrades. And I know Connecticut has an open proceeding on that exact topic. And as I think Massachusetts also did some progress on that, also in their grid mod proceeding. And then finally, the wholesale market participation side is, for a lot of people, not like, people don't think of a state level policy as being that significant related to wholesale markets and their policies. But with the advent of FERC Order 2222 and the compliance filings that a lot of the ISOs have now completed, and the timelines of their implementation of Order 2222, that has a lot of implications for state level policy for energy storage and other DERs. And I think most of the states are just now starting to recognize or starting to open up their proceedings and initiatives to think about what are the things that they need to do to make sure that they are enabling distributed storage to form virtual power plants and participate in their wholesale markets. And so that's something to look forward to in the next year, as more and more states look at what they need to do and on either interconnection or other kinds of operational concerns or planning concerns, and interacting with their wholesale market in that way. So that's something to look forward to. That we haven't seen a whole lot of progress in that in the last year, but we should be coming up pretty fast for many states. Okay, and then the next slide. This really quickly, cost policies usually are what we talk about, soft costs. State level policy, we don't think of that normally affecting hard costs that much, but some of the major ones, the soft costs that affect energy storage are interconnection. It's a perennial problem. That there haven't been a whole lot of, hasn't been a ton of progress on that at the state level, but I do want to note that IREC did a new version of their model interconnection procedures that states can look to as to help them kind of accelerate their changes to interconnection to accommodate energy storage. Also permitting. And again, this is not usually as much as state level policy. It's more of like a local level policy. But there are, examples of like state level legislation and things that do affect permitting and improve permitting processes at the local level. One of the other topics on costs that really affects front of the meter distribution level storage is wholesale distribution tariffs. And so we've seen some progress here and there in a couple states that have taken that up. But again, it's another topic that as states recognize that they want to deploy more front of the meter distribution level storage, that this topic is going to be one that they have to tackle pretty fast and right away. And then finally, financing in terms of cost policies is like what kinds of programs and policies, like state level green banks and other kinds of policies, can help the financing of energy storage. Again, we've seen some progress on that front in terms of different green banks getting more familiar with energy storage. But then the big thing that's coming down the pike is really like access to the federal funds. Both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law as well as the Inflation Reduction Act had provisions that provided a lot of money to state programs and agencies to provide financing for clean energy technologies. So there's an opportunity there for states to figure out how they best access that money in order to fund the financing of energy storage in their states. And so that's like, I think there's going to be efforts all around the country. If your state hasn't started doing that yet, it should be doing it pretty soon to think about how to access that money. And then finally, incentives. Sorry, next slide. Finally, incentive programs. Again, incentive programs are designed to bridge the gap between revenues and costs. Usually they're used to get market segments going, but then they should be designed to go away eventually. And then so some of the updates, Connecticut Energy Storage Program that we mentioned before is kind of a mixed program. It's a program that has grid services. It also has upfront incentives. They made some changes to their residential incentive. The New York incentive that was so successful earlier on, a couple years ago, and has been kind of like out of money for a little while, is looking to hopefully to have a new proposal to refund it, or it was proposed to refund it last year. We're hoping that actually happens this year. The New Jersey storage incentive program that's been kind of stalled for a couple of years. We're hoping to get a new straw proposal for that within this soon, as soon as possible. And then in California, there's a new program called the DEBA, the Distributed Electricity Backup Assets Program, that started to have some RFPs that are, it's an incentive program also, that's going to start to have, that had its first RFP released last month for the bulk level. But then it's going to hopefully have a couple more RFPs come out in the next 3 to 6 months. And then on kind of the side of a maturing market is like the SCHIP funding, which was like the first energy storage incentive program in the country, really of any scale, is actually kind of cutting back a little bit. It's kind of maturing to where the funds are going more towards like directed market segments like disadvantaged communities, but it's also being cut back a little bit from the original goal of some of the legislation that happened the last couple of years. So that's what's been happening, as we're hoping to see more of the programs like states like Maryland, which have a storage target, and potentially Maine, which has its storage target, to have more other incentive programs designed and implemented in the coming years. So that's my very quick overview. I think that's my last slide. We can go to the next slide. Yeah. So that's it for my overview, and welcome any questions after the speakers have gone. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Ted. We will now be joined by Julian Boggs.
Thank you, everybody. Julian Boggs, Director for State Policy with Key Capture Energy. Key Capture Energy is a developer, owner, and operator of utility-scale battery energy storage systems. We have a little over 500 megawatts operating in the U.S. right now, and another 100 in construction. In sync with the slide that we showed at the beginning of the webinar, where almost all the storage right now is in California and Texas. We're mostly in Texas, and although we do have 40 megawatts in New York. And so I want to talk about big battery storage and big battery storage participating in wholesale markets. Sorry, I went through that a little. Okay, now I have mastery of control of my slides. Specifically, again, thinking about states in which there's non-utility ownership, so independent power producers like ourselves, which is, you know, roughly-ish half the country, and then there are states like California that are kind of a weird hybrid, and so you know, a lot of states don't fit nicely into this is restructured, this is vertically integrated. But basically, one of the big barriers, you know, holding back battery storage development in this half of the country and elsewhere is this kind of mismatch between, okay, here are the revenues that are available to us, and here are our costs. So you see that very simple non-inclusive economics here, right? We've got our plant costs, our interconnection, auxiliary, tax and development. The big thing that this costs half of the graphic misses out is capital costs, the cost of money, and because that's kind of, you know, on all of your CapEx. I didn't quite fit it, although you could easily have it for the graphics purposes. I needed 4 on each side, and then revenues, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you know, these things have to balance out, right? In order to pencil, and in most of the country, they don't balance out. It's not an issue of, oh, this, you know, this storage company thinks they have a better mousetrap and they can make them balance out. It's, you know, we think we have a good mousetrap, but you know, it's nowhere close. When you add up the revenue in the wholesale market based on wholesale market prices, and what any reasonable costs for, you know, the state-of-the-art latest lithium-ion batteries are, it doesn't work. And you could have the reaction and be like, okay, well, you know, storage isn't prime time, right? It's like, well, you know, we just got to keep bringing those costs down and keep working at it, and hopefully those costs will continue to come down. But you can say they don't work, but in model after model, when we look at the system costs, and so we put something into, you know, a capacity expansion model, you know, optimized with a production cost model, which is looking at what is the entire cost of running your wholesale grid on a system with storage and without storage. And that's how a lot of these storage targets are set in a lot of these states. The number isn't totally just picked out of thin air. That is cost effective. It is cheaper to have the storage online. So if it's cheaper to have the storage online, there's some money, there's some value that the storage is creating that it's not getting paid through these mechanisms. And you can try to do wholesale market reforms to try to make more money available for storage in some of these ways. Or maybe there's people talk about, oh, there needs to be some ramping service that storage doesn't get paid for that they should, or we should get a higher capacity value, or, you know, whatever it is. But the fact of the matter is that this is the situation, is that, you know, in a given market, New York, we know 6,000 gigawatts of storage is going to be needed. And the wholesale markets aren't showing that they need that through the prices that are available in the energy market, in the capacity market, and the ancillary service market. So that is the fundamental problem that we're trying to solve when we talk about storage in these wholesale markets. It's a little bit of an easier situation in storage in vertically integrated markets, which I'm not going to talk about right here, but this is where you have utility ownership of generation, and you have utility planning is determining what resources deploy other than just market signals. And so that production cost model that will show you, okay, what is the optimal system? It shows, say, DTE in Michigan or APS in Arizona. They run the models and it shows, oh, we need gigawatts of storage. Let's start building, let's start contracting. And so they just do that and they pay for it, and it's built into their portfolios, and they charge ratepayers for it in the rate base. And like that all, you know, that all pencils out because the portfolio pencils out for those companies in those, for those utilities in those models. But that's not exactly how the economics work for, independent power producers or generators in places with wholesale markets where you can't just kind of internalize all those values. Okay, so I want to specifically talk about the three gold things here real quick. And don't worry, I don't have that many slides, so I'm allowed to spend a little more time on each slide, particularly this one. I think Todd at the intro showed some lists of all the various things that people are doing with batteries. I think that was the EIA data, and like that's obviously true. And like we've some of those lists are on us because we've got batteries in the wholesale market. But fundamentally, if you're in the wholesale market, if you're not a non-wires alternatives, if you're a utility scale battery, you're really just doing one thing, which is you're following wholesale market signals. And that's all that's kind of all that matters for the purposes of determining your costs and revenues and sort of policy planning purposes. So everybody is going to be participating in capacity markets where they exist. Texas, no capacity market. Obviously, we don't participate in it there. But everybody is going to be participating in the capacity market, and that doesn't come at the expense of energy or ancillary services or anything in that. So that's okay. We're going to get our capacity revenue. We're going to participate on those auctions. We're going to clear energy. So this means charging when energy is cheap, discharging it when it's expensive, energy arbitrage, and that is net revenue for us and net value for the system. And that, that you could say that provides the service of, shifting demand, reducing peak load, balancing renewables, integrating renewables. It provides all those services that are words, but like, I think if you think about it, like economically, what are we doing? We're charging when it's cheap, we're discharging when it's expensive. And then ancillary services, a whole alphabet soup of various products. I think also, as Todd mentioned, that's a big one where batteries are playing a big role earlier. I will say it's a little bit of a mirage because ancillary services markets are valuable but thin. And so frequency regulation in many markets is paying a lot of money for this very specific services that the grids need to keep the grids at 60 hertz. But it only needs so many megawatts of frequency regulation. And as more batteries come online, they can all provide that service very well and very effectively. The value plummets. You only need a few hundred megawatts. That's not going to sustain the amount of storage that we need on the grid. So I think sometimes those ancillary services numbers can be a little bit deceptive, particularly early on. But anyway, this is the name of the game right here, is thinking about, okay, how do we get the revenue to equal the costs? The revenue does not equal the costs, and so we need state support, we need policy. The last thing I want to say about this slide, and going to the next slide, is contracting. So the other thing about these gold slides, gold widgets right here, ancillary services, energy, capacity, our revenues, is not only do they not equal the costs, is that they are very uncertain over the next 15, 20 years, over the lifetime of your project. Or if you're developing a project right now, you're going to put it online in 5 years, and then it's going to be operating, and you need at least 10 years of revenue after that. So you're talking about making long-term projections about what the price of capacity is going to be, about what are your credited value of capacity, but it is the daily volatility of the market, what future ancillary services are going to be there. These are wildly unpredictable. And if we are financing projects that are hundreds of millions of dollars, or at least tens of millions of dollars, our investors need to have revenue visibility. And sticking your finger up to the wind and trying to guess, okay, here's what energy revenues are going to be in 15 years is a fool's errand. And investors, well, it's not a fool's errand. It's a lot of people make a lot of money making those guesses if they're right. But I should say, for financing battery at scale and meeting the goals that we think we should all be hitting, it's going to take a lot more certainty in those revenues than just the guesses that we have available to us now, the informed guesses. Okay, so we need the state support. For these projects, what we are really talking about with state support is long-term contracts. We have done short-term incentives. The New York program that Ted mentioned, that has short-term incentives for small projects, residential batteries, commercial batteries, as well as utility scale projects. So the 40 megawatts we have in New York was funded through the that incentive program. But at scale, one-time incentives, payment programs that don't have that revenue certainty, that revenue availability, are you need long-term contracts at scale. That's the name of the game. That is, I think policymakers are increasingly getting that. I think we, as an industry of large-scale developers of battery storage projects, of utility-scale battery storage projects, are getting more clear in articulating this point. But it is all about long-term contract. It's all about managing risk. I think some of these things could spend a whole webinar on contract design, and so I'm going to be a little bit quicker about this. But the universe of the long-term contracts that we see out there, you actually see all of these in California, which kind of makes sense if you think about, like, that's where most of the storage is right now. They've been doing that the longest. So tolling agreements is where you basically give control of the battery over to the utility in exchange for you're renting the battery to the utility for a fixed monthly payment. So you get, so say your battery, these are not close to real numbers because I don't want to, say price net, so these aren't in the ballpark, but say it costs $100 a month to run your battery, or to, that's your all-in revenue requirement. Then the utility pays you $100 a month, and you and the utility just discharges you, and the utility will get all the revenues in the capacity market from that, or in the wholesale markets. They'll get energy, ancillaries, and capacity. So the utility in that way kind of absorbs those costs. So that's one way to do that. The other thing that we see in California a lot is resource adequacy. You say RA only in California, or I like to think of it as a capacity sales agreement. And this is where there's just a fixed monthly amount. So this would be smaller. So say if you need $100, you would just get paid from your contract would be for, say, $30. And then you've got $70 a month that you still need. You can get that you participate in the market, you get that from the market. So you get your $70 from the market, add that from the $30 for the state. So it looks a little bit more like an incentive program. That the main difference is that it's paid out over time, and so you have that guaranteed consistent revenue. And I should say, actually, what's going on in California is that they're not just giving you that $30 a month, they're actually buying your capacity value, and they're meeting their capacity obligation, but you still are free to earn revenue in the energy and ancillary services market. And then the third thing is something a little newer, and it's something interesting. It's something my company, Key Capture Energy, is really intrigued by, and has been advocating for in a lot of places. And these are sort of a class that I would call index energy storage contracts. These are in California as well. They're a little less common, but PG&E offers these and has signed a number of deals on them. And this is the program that New York has proposed. And it's index storage credits in New York is what they call it. But this actually, it has that payment from the state, but it's dynamic. And the payment from the state varies based on how much money is in your wholesale market. Again, you can do a whole webinar on the index energy storage contracts. I have, but I'll do the very briefest. The idea there is that it's trying to just really accurately match and fine tune exactly how much money is missing for you in the wholesale market, in order to fill that missing money gap, to accurately fill that missing money gap, while still giving you all the incentives to, do your time shifting of energy, your daily energy arbitrage, to participate in the frequency regulation services or reserve services when those are the most valuable, and of course to participate in the capacity market. What all of these are designed around is to reduce risk, because again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, putting money at risk. Investors need to see a path to their returns. So there's basically two kinds of risk that we talk about, and the contracts mitigate these risks differently. So it's market structure risk and then performance risk. Market structure risk means that the money isn't there at all. Or that's the risk, that the money isn't there at all, that continues not to be there at all. It's like, okay, we all think that there's going to be a ton of solar coming online. We're all going to have this duck curve. That's going to mean there's a bunch of money in the energy markets, XYZ reasons, that money might not materialize. And then performance risk. So that's the risk that no matter what you do, however I operate a battery, it might not be on me at all, but I don't make the money I thought I was going to, just because the market didn't show up. And then there's performance risk that's just kind of that's like, did I perform in the market? Did I discharge at the right time? Did I discharge on the right time? Did I, participate in ancillaries when it was most valuable? And really, we think that contracts should be designed to limit market structure risk, but they should put the performance risk on us. That's kind of what we're supposed to be bringing to the table. All right, that was the main thing. I'm actually going to skip this one. Talk to me later about index energy storage credits. I realize we're running out of time, and you got to hear from Joan. Ted went through a bunch of these states, but I just want to point out a few of these things. So this is where, from my perspective, looking at the utility scale batteries, this is where we're really seeing a lot of action. So we talked about New York. New York, by the way, it's a 6,000 megawatt program overall, and they're talking about doing 3,000 megawatts through this index storage credit mechanism. So that's, I know, because there was 3 and now it's 6, and now I'm saying 3, but it's now 6 overall, and then half of that 3 gigawatts is through this specific procurement. In Maine, what they're actually doing, so they actually passed this bill, they passed this legislation, and now the Energy Office is actually designing contracts. It's figuring out what kinds of contracts are we going to do this potential 200 megawatt or even more, maybe procurement in 2025. Ted mentioned that Illinois bill. Connecticut, we actually just have their own, we have a draft RFP out from them. They're supposed to do the final on Wednesday. Not sure they're going to hit that target. I hope they do. But in Connecticut, we actually have an RFP out for, they're accepting bids for contracts, or very soon. And they actually came out with their own contract, but it's closest to that resource adequacy only contract type that I mentioned. And then, sorry, I forgot the name of the Maryland bill, but I knew Ted was going to talk about the Maryland issue because he's been imminently involved. So the last thing I want to say is just fire safety is a top concern. In New York, there was a run of incidents this summer, and we're expecting any day now recommendations from the governor's fire safety working group on how to implement that, on how to improve fire safety. Getting fire safety right is a must for the industry. We all have to be better. We have to police ourselves better, and we're going to need, there's going to be legislation, there's going to be rules and policies. And so working with regulators effectively to make sure that those support safe and effective development of battery storage is critical. Some of the things that are just kind of like no-brainers, that just like NFPA 855, the NFPA standard for stationary storage systems, just getting into law that that the systems need to follow the most applicable version of that. File emergency response plans. Texas leads the nation in this. So every storage system in Texas is required to file an emergency response plan. They're the first to require this. I should say NFPA 855 and emergency response plan are now in law in Michigan with the new siting bill that just passed. And then also first responder training. Critical that local governments know what to do when there's a fire at a large scale battery system. It's a lot of times it's stuff that they haven't dealt with before. So certainly it's something industry best practice, Key Capture always does, is offer that training to the locals. Having that in requirements is fine too. And this is coming whether or not we ask for it or not. A lot of states, you're seeing legislation right now, new rules around battery storage, fire safety. So let's be sure to work with policymakers here. That's all I got. Apologies if I went over a lot. I will hand it over to Joan.
Great, thank you, Julian. Joan, you are up.
Great. Thank you so much, Julian. And a really big thanks to Ted and Julian and Todd for kind of doing some table setting. I'm batting cleanup here, and we are running like a little behind time, so I'm going to try to kind of motor through some of the content. I'm going to be covering, I'm from the Solar Energy Industries Association. We're a leading trade association that does a lot of work in front of Congress and a ton of work in the state level, like state legislatures, but also regulatory dockets, PUCs. We do a fair amount of RTO and FERC kind of level as well. So we've got a good overview.
Joan, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your audio is a little funky. Would it be possible to super quickly put a headset on or maybe call in on a telephone number?
Yeah, why don't I call in? I think that's probably the easiest. Or if I lean in a little bit, is that better?
The sound quality is a little funky. So if on
Okay.
the webinar console, if you click, you've got computer audio selected. If you click phone call, it will allow you just to call in, and it'll show you the number.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all. No, I'm so glad you said.
Todd, while we're doing that, I don't know if there's any really exciting questions that have come in to give Jonah a minute to get her audio together.
Yeah, there are tons of exciting questions that have come in, but I don't want to start a discussion because I'm hoping that she'll get reconnected momentarily.
Samantha, I'm having a hard time finding the what you're talking about. Sorry, I don't use GoTo all that often.
Give me 1
so
second.
I don't actually but the audio. But if you just
give me 1 second.
chat me,
I'll
I'll
find it.
that way.
All right.
Okay, well, since we are waiting for a moment for Joan's audio to get fixed, and I apologize for this. Ted, if you're still here, somebody wanted to know why Texas wasn't appearing on your maturity chart of states, and I was having a hard time figuring that out myself, so I thought I'd go ahead and pitch that to you, if you can answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wasn't able to put the all of the states on the maturity, where they are on the maturity chart. I would off the top of my head, I would actually from a state policy point of view, I would say that Texas is very early in their maturity. And you think of each of those rows, they don't have any target, so they didn't set a storage target. On the revenue side, they have the wholesale market revenues, which are what's driving all that deployment in there. And so they're, I would say in the growth stage of that side. But then on the cost side, in terms of interconnection and permitting and necessarily those things, as well as they have fewer, if any, incentives on the side, especially especially the kind of distribution level markets, like either behind the meter or distribution level front of the meter. I would say those market segments are still very early and not very mature from a policy point of view at all. We're just getting into I mentioned, the non-wire solutions. The whole area is just still in pilot phase at a very small level. So yeah, that's where I characterize Texas.
Thank you. Are we good with Joan's audio at this point?
I think she is trying to dial in right now.
Yeah, I'm dialed in, but I'm getting some weird echo. I'm trying to mute my speakers.
Yep. So if on the webinar console right now you have computer audio selected, and you're going to want to select phone call if you open the audio box on the webinar console.
It's the third from the top on the right in the console. It says sharing webcam and then audio. Open the audio and switch it over to phone.
Oh, amazing. Okay, I think I got it. I am so sorry. What a hot mess. Can folks
You're totally
hear me now?
fine. You're totally fine.
Okay.
You sound great. Thanks.
Great. Okay, yeah, you think 4 years into the pandemic, we'd all have this down. So I'm just gonna talk into my phone. Let me know, someone chat me if you can't hear me. But I appreciate you interrupting me, Samantha, so we could get the audio working and get that all worked out. Okay, so I described a little bit what SEIA is and what we do. We're a trade association that represents solar, but we also do a ton in storage, both standalone and storage paired with solar. We've got about 1,000 member companies, and we work in jurisdictions all across the U.S., both in legislatures, in PUCs, also in front of FERC, at most of the RTOs, and in Congress. So we've got a good kind of bird's eye view of what happened in energy storage in 2023. So I'm batting cleanup a little bit. The first thing, before I kind of get deep into slides, I wanted to just address a little bit of the why are California and Texas so big? On the one hand, California has a lot of programs in place to support storage, but on the other hand, the market fundamentals really are there. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of revenue to be had in energy arbitrage, and the same is true in Texas. And just goes to show that when you hit that tipping point, when the value of storage truly is captured in a market design, you can see a market take off in this exponential curve. And we've seen that in California and Texas. They've got really big deltas between their off-peak energy and their on-peak energy costs. And those deltas happen a lot of hours out of the year. So those are pretty solid revenue streams. In addition to the resource adequacy payments in California really are a representation of the forward capacity value for storage. And then the other big thing about market design that I wanted to make sure we all keep in mind is that the biggest market distortion we see is that there's no carbon price in energy federal wholesale markets at all. So whenever you're looking at a state model and it's got some kind of decarbonization element, what's the cheapest way to have a reliable grid and get to low or no carbon, it's going to show storage as a cost-effective option. But when we look at wholesale markets, there's no reflection of the cost of climate change or the cost of carbon. So I think probably the biggest thing we could do in terms of market design is to incorporate the cost of carbon into energy prices. And then that brings me to kind of the forward capacity market distortions that we've seen. In almost every RTO, there are major fossil units that are truly ready to retire. The fuel costs are too high, they need major renovations that are going to be expensive. But those RTOs are not allowing those fossil units to retire because they kind of need them for capacity purposes. So those fossil units are getting these out-of-market uplift payments. So we've seen the Mystic unit in New Hampshire, it's a big coal-fired generator, for example, is receiving massive out-of-market payments to show up on just a few days a year and stay open, basically. So I think once we start seeing those fossil units really retire, we'll begin to see a little bit more action in just the, kind of market spaces. All right, I'm going to jump in a little bit to trade and manufacturing, which I think no one's really hit on that yet. So some of this might be new information. We just put out last fall a U.S. storage manufacturing roadmap to kind of take a look at what are some of the supply and demand dynamics in the manufacturing space. So this slide speaks to a point that Todd made earlier, which is that the majority of battery manufacturing are going to go to EV applications. So this is a chart of global demand. Or I guess this isn't total global, this is USA plus free trade agreement countries, so kind of US and allies. And a significant portion of that is devoted to EVs. So I've circled this kind of light blue bar here, and that's really the market that we're talking about, the US kind of energy storage on the grid market. So it's actually a little larger than I would have guessed. If I had to kind of guess, I'd say 5% of manufacturing, but it's looking more 24 to 25% overall by 2030 is going to be devoted to energy storage standalone. I mean, not standalone, but for grid applications. So the next kind of piece I wanted to hit is the manufacturing capacity pipeline. So our consultants who did this report, CRU, I would totally recommend them. What they did is they looked at all the upcoming announcements and ones of factory capacity and looked at ones that were actually credible. So did they have financial backing? Did they have some site control, all the things that make an announcement credible? And treated this projection of US and free trade agreement country manufacturing capacity. And the good news is that it looks like we're kind of in a choke point through 2024, but then we're starting to see some major additions come online in 2025, 26. And most of them are responding to the advanced manufacturing tax credit that was part of the IRA. So that's the good news on the manufacturing front. Again, here's just a peek at what the kind of supply chain component announcements look like. So as you can see now, we've got very little manufacturing capacity online, and most of it's focused on cells and packs. But most of the major announcements that we've seen were for actually fully assembled batteries. And if a battery is assembled in the US, it's then eligible for the domestic content adder. So we don't expect that systems are really going to start getting that domestic content adder until that factory capacity is really built out into the 27, 28 timeframe. that's a little picture there. So the next big trend that we expect to see, so I guess this isn't as much of a retrospective as a prospective look at the sort of inputs of manufacturing costs. So right now in the US, one of the biggest manufacturing costs is in cathode material. And that's a little unsurprising because the manufacturing process requires that you like spread this really fine cathode material out on a copper plate or copper film or whatever. And it's like factories when they first open have about a 50% success rate with that process. It really takes some time to like calibrate the equipment and train staff and get that efficient manufacturing in place. In factories in China, we see the efficiency rate, meaning like materials in to usable batteries out, is around 90%. So we expect to see the cost of that cathode material portion of manufacturing decline to 2030, and that accounts for most of the cost declines that we expect to see. And this is a chart that's like dollars per kilowatt hour by 2030. So declining costs in cathode, which is good. Cathode's kind of the largest cost component. Okay, our manufacturing report kind of gives a rundown of all the major minerals, but the main choke point, unsurprisingly, is lithium. So we kind of took a look at supplies for lithium, both in kind of free trade agreement countries and in the US. And again, that's going to allow people to get the sort of advanced manufacturing credit and then also some of the domestic content credit. But the raw lithium, we have very, very few potential supplies in the US, but luckily there's a little bit more available in free trade agreement countries. So in terms of like flow of materials, we're expecting to see more mining happening in free trade agreement countries, and then the manufacturing to actually onshore a little bit more. So Julian touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to touch on it again and just really emphasize the point that a huge piece of what we saw in 2023 was that the perception of fire risk, not actual fire risk, like we all in the industry know that the labs and others have done an incredible job at developing safe materials and containers and emergency protocols, but that the perception of fire risk can put a full stop on development. So in New York, after those 3 battery fires, there was a complete stop of the kind of roadmap to get up to 600 gigawatts, or sorry, not 600 gigawatts, I'm sorry, I'm a little like off my game. The second piece of their roadmap, which was doubling their planned storage capacity over the next few years, they had kind of some new incentive programs rolling up, which Julian talked about, but it put a complete stop to it until an investigation could be conducted, and we're expecting to see like a root cause analysis and report coming out soon about those fires. So that just means like in dockets that you're active in, it's very important to recommend NFPA 855 be implemented, explain to the public and to regulators what the safety levels from battery fires really are, and then to put that risk in perspective for the rest of the energy system. You know, it's not a risk-free system. So we've got, and the California kind of Energy Storage Association has some kind of forward-looking public relations campaigns related to this issue. The next topic that Todd asked me to cover, and again, I'm batting cleanup, so I apologize, I'm like kind of all over the place, is FERC Order 2022 implementation. And like my personal hot take on this is that FERC 2022 at the moment is a big nothing burger. And the reason that's true is that most of the implementation timelines for the RTOs don't kick in until like 26, 27, there's even a couple in 2029. So we're not actually seeing the large-scale participation of aggregated resources into the wholesale markets. And keep in mind that all 2022 does is unlock participation in the wholesale markets. If the underlying market fundamentals aren't there, meaning there's a big delta between off and on-peak energy that's sustained throughout the year, and then 2, there are like reasonable, reliable forward capacity payments, the resources aren't going to show up. So 2022, the timeline is long. And the revenue in most markets just isn't there to sustain on wholesale revenue alone. This is a little bit out of date. The status, most of these statuses have been updated since this chart was last updated, but the reason I wanted to show this slide is so that you can see the docket numbers and kind of go check out at FERC what their 2022 implementation looks like. And almost all the RTOs have kind of informal proceedings around 2222 implementation that you can be a part of, and SEIA has participated in various ones. The next kind of big development in 2023 that we saw was FERC Order 2023. which was the implementation of the FERC interconnection NOPR that they released in 2022. So this order, there were a couple small wins for storage that I wanted to point out. It basically, a lot of the RTOs were modeling storage as like a worst case scenario, so that they would be withdrawing energy from the grid at peak load conditions, and that they would need like firm transmission capacity. And so that was sinking a lot of projects because the interconnection cost to provide that firm service was just too high. So FERC Order 2023 requires that RTOs or transmission owners, so even if they're not in an RTO, transmission owners need to have a tariff that will allow storage to be modeled as a not worst case scenario. So they're only drawing during off-peak periods, for example, and they don't require firm transmission service. So there's a little bit of unclarity in some of that. We're intervening in some of these dockets to kind of hopefully get some best practices in place at the RTO level. But like the other takeaway from this is that FERC Order 2023 improves the interconnection process. It imposes some timelines. It allows cluster studies, et cetera. It absolutely does not clean up the dumpster fire that is interconnection at the RTO level. Like, in order to reach our decarbonization goals, we need a grid that is 2 to 3 times our current size. And FERC Order 2023 does not plan or finance that grid in any way. So I would describe it as like nibbling around the edges of the interconnection problem, but what we actually need is a major federal transmission policy piece of legislation that like figures out a way to fund the whole build out and figures out a way to plan and site the whole build out. So tiny wins, but I would say like not anything to super write home about in regards to interconnection and storage. Let's see. Okay, just a couple future issues. Fire safety, which we talked about. End of life disposition. We didn't have time to get into it today, but like safe disposal, recycling, reuse of materials. It's a little more economical for batteries than it is for solar because the input materials are very expensive. So I think we'll see a little more recycling, but that's an issue on the horizon for us. And keep in mind, batteries have a shorter lifespan than solar panels. So the issue is going to crop up much sooner for us in this part of the industry. And then the sustainable and just sourcing of raw materials. So we've really got to get a handle on that. And then the other issue that I wanted to cover, I don't really have a great slide on it, is the potential of energy storage to address energy justice and inequity issues. So unlike solar or other renewable resources, energy storage really can fill a gap for people who are vulnerable in the event of an outage. And that specifically would be like elderly people or people with disabilities that rely on medical equipment that requires electricity. So what we saw a little bit in 2023, mostly just in California, but I hope to see more of in 2024, and we're certainly rolling into all of our advocacy, is program design that specifically supports storage being installed for people who are vulnerable during outages to provide greater reliability. So I'm sorry to motor so much. We only have 10 minutes left. I think I'm going to just turn it back to Todd for questions. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thank you, Joan. And sorry to everybody again for the technical difficulties. Let's get everybody back on camera if we can. And we have a lot of questions that we'll get to as many as we can. So one thing that, and Dr. Gyuk, if you can come on screen too, if you fixed your camera issue, otherwise, if you could join us at least by audio, that would be great. So tons of questions. Here's something that it's sort of an area that we didn't really address. Somebody is saying that they hope that the growth in virtual power plants is going to be covered, as well as vehicle to grid and vehicle to home. If anybody wants to address that, I know we touched on a little bit on the VPP with some of the connected solutions and similar programs, but everybody always wants to know, when is vehicle to grid, vehicle to home coming? When can I, plug my EV into my house and have a resilient system and sign up for utility programs? And anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, as a quick remark, energy from your car isn't free. And it's not just the cost of the gasoline, because for any time that you use your car as a source of electricity, it's equivalent to driving on the road. And your car battery will age even though you've never been on the road. And so if you want to keep your battery, which is an expensive piece of equipment, you're not going to use it for powering your house. Now, if the electricity goes out and you're in the middle of a hurricane, then by all means use your car battery and stay warm.
I'll make a quick comment on VPPs, and I mentioned that in the context of Order 2222, but I do want to encourage people to make a distinction between energy storage and VPPs, and where most VPPs need energy storage to form a VPP to be be effective. It's not the same thing, and it's kind of like the Maryland law has actually made this mistake in calling VPPs and energy storage technology, which it isn't really, and it may be useful from a kind of industry description point of view, but from a policy point of view, it doesn't, like, you're not using VPPs to meet the energy storage target in the law of Maryland. So I would just encourage people to make that distinction, and obviously very important, and we're hugely supportive of VPPs and making sure they can do all the things they can do. But as an energy storage technology, it's not an energy storage technology itself.
Okay.
I'd love to jump in. Oh, sorry.
Sure,
Todd.
go ahead. I just I want to get more than one or two questions in if we can, but yeah, go ahead, John.
I'll just say like one sentence, which is what we're seeing on the ground is utilities and commissions still are very nervous about VPPs. Like, will they actually show up when we need them? So I think publicizing some of the studies that show VPPs are quite reliable is important. That's all.
We are doing our best. Okay, has any state proposed assessing the greenhouse gas impacts of their fossil fuel power plants, taxing those emissions, and using the proceeds to finance long duration energy storage and green hydrogen projects? That's a mouthful. I don't know the answer. Does anybody know if that's happening?
I don't think that. You go ahead, John. Oh, I mean, that's in almost all, particularly, so if you think about New York right now is undergoing a big proceeding around a cap and trade proposal. Certainly, firm, clean resources are a piece of that. I don't think you're talking about a direct transfer of money from the fossil to whether multi-day or any other clean, firm source. But in the context of, are we doing 100% carbon-free grid that is going to have some cost, whether through a carbon price or something else, and then funding a bunch of resources that we're going to need? Obviously, long duration is a piece of that. Certainly, New York and as in California have various policies in place. They don't exactly do that.
Yeah, and I was going to point to RGGI, which is the kind of New England and adjacent states auction. It's a cap, trade, and lower, so it caps emissions, collects revenue from polluting units, and then distributes that revenue back out to the states. None of the states that I know of are using it to fund storage. Most of them use it to fund energy efficiency right now, which is also like a 10 out of 10 great use of that money. But if we saw prices that actually reflect the real cost of carbon, it could potentially generate more revenue. So cap and trade is a little like out of fashion right now, but like it's a great tool.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, just one really quick. The other closest thing is the analogy is the Clean Peak program in Massachusetts is the closest thing to where they're trying to incent storage to provide essentially emissions reductions by shifting clean energy to the peaks. And it's kind of what I think of as an interim policy idea. It's an okay idea, but it's one that where you eventually want to get to carbon pricing actually in the wholesale markets, like Julian mentioned, I think. But but it's an okay interim policy until you can get carbon pricing in your wholesale markets.
Yeah, I think I would actually, you might disagree with me, but I would argue that the mechanism already exists in the form of RPSs, almost every state. And it's a kind of a proxy. It doesn't really track emissions specifically, but the mechanism is there. And if you put storage into your RPS program, or you alternately took the ACP, the alternative compliance payments, and put those into storage incentives, then you could do a lot with that. That's what most states are doing to promote renewables, and very few of them have specifically incorporated storage or brought storage into those programs. But those programs exist. They're well established and funded, and I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Okay, somebody wants to know: are ancillary services benefits enough to make a storage project work financially for the developer or utility? And are ancillary services feasible only with front of the meter storage, or can they work with distributed behind the meter storage?
On the first one, I would say they have been. So Texas, almost that entire build out, I think you showed, Todd, at the beginning of almost all of that is funded by ancillary services. A lot of it is reserves and various reserve products. I say funded by ancillary services, like a lot of the revenues that we make each year, my company and the other companies involved in that are through reserves products. But I do not think that one can generally expect that those revenues to meet the entire revenue needs of the storage over the course of the period of time. So there's been sort of it's in some places like ISO New England, there have been batteries that have been financed and they've been very successful on frequency regulation, but the end of that gravy train is about over.
And the second part of that, there have been definitely attempts at working at, like, providing those ancillary services from distributed behind the meter storage. Again, those have to be mostly aggregations, and some of what Order 2222 was supposed to do was to help defray or reduce the overhead costs on a per asset basis, so that it's actually economical for 1,000 units to together provide an ancillary service under the requirements of the ISO. But in the past, there hasn't been enough money there to overcome the extra overhead costs of all those thousands of assets have to do to participate in those markets.
Okay, we're at 2:30. Are we? Can you guys stay for a minute or two longer to get to a couple more questions?
Sure.
Yes. Okay, terrific. Somebody was asking about rate setting for incentives for states. We are actually, about to pput out a little white paper on that probably in February, but I thought I'd throw it out to the panel. It's kind of all over the place. And I recently looked at this, rates are kind of all over the place. It's very hard to compare apples to apples across state incentive programs. They're all structured so differently. If a state is interested in some kind of incentive for storage, how do you, know how to set those rates? You don't want it too rich. You don't want it too lean. You want it in sort of a sweet spot where it's going to result in deployment, but not just give money away. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a couple, but if you go ahead, Ted, I feel like you're heading the Maryland docket. You've got a little bit of an edge there.
Yeah, I mean, I really, the thought process we encourage people to go through is modeled a lot after the New York process, and what they did with their roadmap, the original roadmap, was really look at, again, do at least an initial analysis of the revenues and the costs, and you're looking at trying to figure out that gap. What is that gap that your incentive is supposed to bridge? And then once you have an estimate of that gap, then you add maybe like 20% to it, just to make sure that your program gets off the ground. And that's how you start the program, your incentive program, and then you design it for it to go down. As I was saying before, is like over time, as the market matures and the costs come down, and you create more revenues, through grid services programs and other kinds of revenue opportunities, then that incentive gap should get smaller, and you should design that into your program. So basically, it's like if you're doing it for the first time and you're just trying to get a whole market segment going, you do that estimate and you put a little extra on top just to make sure that it works, and then that's just the basic thought process.
Yeah, I want to just add one thing to that, which is like you essentially have got two options when it comes to pricing design. One is administratively determined prices, which is like you go look at costs, you go look at revenues, you find the gap, you provide like some firm incentive contract, whatever, that like gives you that to cover that gap. And I really do love the index storage credit that was going to roll out with the second part of the roadmap in New York that Julian described. So that's your kind of administrative price setting method. I want to layer onto that the option of like a reverse auction pricing mechanism. And this really only works well for front of the meter storage or like larger assets where you have a certain amount of capacity you're trying to fill and you have people submit bid prices on a competitive basis. And then you open the bids up a few times so that people can see other people's bids and whether they made it into the stack and say like, basically, how low can we go? And that adds an element that is lacking in purely administrative price setting, which is that you get a little bit of competition and that can get your resources more cost effectively for ratepayers. So I like to see those two work in tandem, like maybe the administrative price setting kind of sets a ceiling, and then there's a competitive bidding process that can drive prices down a little bit on top of that. It doesn't work as well for behind the meter systems because it's just hard to, like, how do you get, what are you going to have homeowners bid in or something? But there are major players who develop storage systems at the residential level. So there's probably some way to do dynamic price discovery using those larger players. So I think those are your two major routes, and barring like an open market forum, I think the reverse auction mechanism is pretty good.
Okay, great. Somebody is asking about storage as transmission only assets, and saying that some RTO and ISO areas, and I hate the acronym, so some of the areas of the country that have independent grid operators that are managing wholesale markets have adopted rules about storage as a transmission only asset. And the question is, would you describe these policies as a primary or secondary driver for energy storage in the future?
For us, we don't really see it as a driver at all. I should say it is certainly not a driver right now, anywhere. I think varying companies, various people may have different views at the at the optimism about where where it may go in the future, and people just, oh, look at the overall numbers. Joan, I think you mentioned we need a 2x, 3x our transmission system. Many gigawatts of capacity. Like, if only a portion of that is battery storage, that changes our storage goals. So the potential is vast. The regulatory barriers are so mighty, and the barriers, not forget like your cost allocation, like who pays for what kind of challenges. If you're talking about a rate-based or a competitively procured asset, but just the reliability is in your standards that the grid operators are using when they're thinking about transmission. A storage asset it looks so different from a transmission line. We're very far away, and it would be a better and more efficient system. And if we could do storage as transmission, but MISO, sorry, Todd, for the alphabet soup, but the grid operator in the Midwest and the New York grid operator, NISO, they have open investigations, but does not look imminent, anyone about to, buy a bunch of storage as transmission.
Okay, well, I think we should probably wrap this up. I do appreciate everybody. Thank you for your presentations. We will be posting the slides and the recorded webinar to the website at SEIA, where we archive all the webinars, and within a day or two, you'll be able to go and download those if you'd like to take a look or send them to somebody. And Samantha, do we want to announce anything before we go?
Sure. Well, on your screen, you can see the titles and dates for 2 upcoming webinars that we have in February. One on peaker power plants in New York City, and the other an update from Berkeley Lab on their solar adopter income and demographic trends research. 2 super interesting topics. So I hope everyone will consider joining us for those. Thank you so much to our speakers today. That was amazing. And I hope we see everyone next time. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.